Greetings. Still a bit busy these days. That's why I've been so inactive on this channel, but I hope to have some videos soon. But I just wanted to churn out something really quickly. Earlier today, I was at the store, and while I was at the front counter of the store and my items were being rung up, I noticed that the name on the name tag of the young man who was ringing up my items read Mortaza. And, I wound up quietly thinking to myself about the structure of that name. And so, I don't know, I felt compelled to make a quick video in which I shared my musings, And honestly, it's going to be, most of this video is just going to be background, and then I'll probably sum up my actual thoughts in like a few seconds or something like that. And this isn't going to be a very serious video, but I suspect that at least a few people might find it interesting, and that's why I wanted to share it. I find it interesting. So the name Mortaza, or sometimes Morteza, sometimes transliterated with an E on that second syllable. However, this young man had it as an A, but whatever you want to say, Mortaza, Morteza, it might be described as a Persian or Urdu name, and I suspect that the young man who rang my things up at the store was Desi, he's Indian or Pakistani or something like that, of that extraction. But the name Mortaza, like many Muslim names, is a loan word from Arabic. And the relevant Arabic word or relevant Arabic name is Murtaḍa. Now, you may have noticed that the pronunciation and transliteration previously had a Z phoneme, while now it has a D phoneme, Mortaza, Murtaḍa. Right? At the center of that difference is the Arabic letter dad, right? And, as the Arabic script was adopted for the writing of Farsi, of Persian, and later for Hindustani, or what we might now call Urdu, this character came to be pronounced along the lines of Z, of a Z phoneme. It's called Zwad in Farsi and Zwad in Urdu. So now, full disclosure, I don't know why that happened with Farsi and Urdu. I don't really know much at all about those languages. But whatever the case, it has an impact on how those languages pronounce certain loan words from Arabic. For a really well-known example, consider the word Ramadan, which is the name of a month in the Islamic calendar in which Muslims fast during the day, right? I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with Ramadan, right? And so, one will typically find Persians and Pakistanis pronouncing the name of that month as Ramazan, or even Ramzan, I've heard, right? So the word is spelled with a dad, with this character dad, but the letter is pronounced Zad in Farsi and Urdu uses, hence why you get Ramazan, or whatever. Now, Muslims who grew up referring to the month as Ramazan occasionally have to endure someone telling them that they're pronouncing the word quote-unquote wrong, Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not casting aspersions on the Persian or Pakistani pronunciations. I fully recognize that it's common for languages to develop different pronunciations for words which they borrowed from other languages. And there's certainly a myriad of examples of that happening in English, and honestly, even in Arabic, more so modern Arabic, but you can even make a case for that happening in classical Arabic. That said, I wanted to share an interesting fact which crossed my mind while I was, standing there in the store contemplating the name Murtaḍa, Mortaza. The Arabic character dad corresponds to the Hebrew character tzadeh. And there are certain roots common to Arabic and Hebrew, certain words and therefore certain roots, which are common to both languages, Arabic and Hebrew, in which the Arabic root will have a dad, while the corresponding Hebrew root will have tzadeh. And we're going to look at a relevant example in a moment. Now, admittedly, one might rightly say that the Hebrew tzadeh is more equivalent to the Arabic sad. And I'll definitely concede that. I'll readily concede that, right? But I would also propose that just as the Hebrew chet in ancient times approximated both the Arabic ha and the Arabic cha, and the ancient Hebrew ayin approximated both the Arabic ayin and ghayin, so too it would not be absurd if ancient Hebrew's sadeh had a similar relationship with the phonemes sad and dad. At least you can see discussions, on Proto-Semitic about a Proto-Semitic dad that somehow has some proximity to the tzadeh. And by the way, I discussed the relevant phenomena briefly in my video titled Arabic Phonemes in Ancient Hebrew. At least I get into the ha and the cha and the ayin and the ghayin, although I don't really get into tzadeh and sad and dad. But whatever the case, that'll discuss this phenomenon of how ancient Hebrew may have had a richer spectrum of phonemes, more in keeping with what we currently find in Arabic. Whatever the case, before we return to discussing the Arabic name Murtaḍa, I want to briefly discuss the verb stem that it's part of. The verb stem which it comes out of, what verb it comes from and what verb stem that's in. And that is the ifta'ala verb stem. Those who are familiar with popular Western categorizations of Arabic verb stems might know this as form 8, right? And as this verb stem gives rise to reflexive verb forms, though is also used to convey de facto passive renderings, I would liken it to the Hebrew verb stem hitpa'el. And for those who are interested, I discussed that Hebrew stem in my videos on Deuteronomy 28. Now, I'm not saying that these two verb stems are identical, but there is considerable similarity between them. For those unfamiliar with, if you're unfamiliar with one or both scripts, I'll transcribe the consonantal structures of each into Latin characters. And in case you're wondering why there's a 3 there, that's standing in place of the ayin, right? Now, the model root for each verb stem is the same. It's fa ayin lam in the Arabic and fe ayin lamed in the Hebrew. And to make it easier to see how similar these verb stems are, I'll color code the roots. Now, one may notice that in the Arabic verb stem, the ta of the prefix, so what appears in the black text in both verb stems is what we consider the prefix, which comes with this particular verb stem. And so the ta of the prefix, which it's represented by a T in the Latin, consistently falls after the first radical of the root, while it generally falls before the first radical in the corresponding Hebrew verb stem. However, a similar transposition does happen with the Hebrew stem depending on what the first letter of the root is, but that's a discussion for another time. One may also note that the prefix of the Arabic verb stem begins with an alif, and while the prefix of the Hebrew verb stem begins with a he. Now, it should also be noted that the corresponding Aramaic verb stem also begins with an aleph, at least generally. But those differences aside, one should at this point be able to sense that these two verb stems are very similar in structure. And I would repeat that both are used to convey reflexive verbs and are also at times both used to convey passive senses of a verb. So with that before us, we can now discuss the name Murtaḍa, which comes from the verb ارتضى, which is the ra, dad, ya root in the افتعل verb stem, that verb stem we just discussed. And corresponding to Arabic's ra, dad, ya root, Hebrew has the resh, tzadeh, yod root, which when put in that aforementioned hitpa'el verb stem gives us the verb hitratse. Now, the two roots on the screen both give rise to notions of like desire or being pleased or being chosen or something like that, seeking approval. And here too, I can transcribe the consonantal structures of each of the verbs into the Latin script. Just as I previously used the number 3 to represent the ayin, here I'm using a number 9 to represent the tzad or tzadeh. However, I placed a dot over one of them to signify that it's actually a dad rather than a sad. And here too, I can color code the root letters. I made the Hebrew tzadeh a slightly different shade of green from the Arabic dad to signify that although they're related, they aren't quite identical, right? And one might also notice that at the end of both verbs, the weak third radical of the root changes, with the ya in the Arabic becoming an alif, alif maksura, and the he in the Hebrew, of the yod at the end of the Hebrew becoming a he. And some might even argue that the Hebrew root should be rendered as resh sadeh he instead. But, whatever the case. By the way, The Hebrew verb can be found in 1 Samuel 29:4, where it appears in the imperfect third-person masculine singular, yitratse, in reference to the Philistines' fear that David might reconcile himself to Saul by betraying them. You know, when used in the reflexive sense, yitratse can mean he will reconcile himself, or he will make himself pleasing, he will gain the pleasure, something like that, of another, right? So at the top of your screen, you see the relevant verb in the imperfect tense, and at the bottom of your screen, you see that same Hebrew verb in the perfect tense. So I'd like to ask, what about the participle of the verb? You know, those who study modern Israeli Hebrew, sometimes perfect tense, imperfect tense, and the participle are treated sort of as past tense, future tense, and present tense, right? That's not quite accurate, you know, vis-a-vis like biblical Hebrew, but nonetheless, you know, think of those three categories: perfect, imperfect, and then participle. So we're looking at the imperfect and the perfect. What about the participle, right? Well, to render either of these verbs into the participle, one simply changes the first letter of the prefix into a mim or a mem, corresponding to the M in the Latin transcription. Now, with the participle of each verb on the screen, at the top of the screen, you now have Murtaḍa, which is the name mentioned at the beginning of this video. Murtaḍa is the participle of ارتضى. As for the Hebrew participle, it's mitratse, right? So the name Murtaḍa is often explained as meaning something like chosen, or having gained God's acceptance, or having the one who has gained God's approval, something like that, chosen by God or something like that, the one whom God is pleased with, etc., right? The corresponding Hebrew participle, mitratse, can mean one who seeks to reconcile himself to another, or seeks the acceptance of another, seeks the favor of another. Now, one might object that the name Murtaḍa is more passive than reflexive, but I think we can still see the similarities at this point, right? And one might even object that the verb ارتضى, you know, when it's used in the Quran a few times, it seems like it's active or whatever. But whatever the case, putting all that aside, the reason why I went on this long-winded segue, and I admit that it's been a bit rambling, but the reason why I went on this long-winded segue is to give the background to the thought that I had as I stood there contemplating the name on the tag of the young man who was ringing up my items. You know, it was in that moment that I found it somewhat amusing that while some, others, not me, but others, might feel tempted to tell that young man that he's quote-unquote mispronouncing his own name, you know, saying Mortaza, or something like that, when really it's supposed to be Murtaḍa. But in a charmingly coincidental way, in this case, the Persian and Urdu pronunciations seems to bring the name closer to the closest corresponding Hebrew term. You know, it's almost as if the renderings of these non-Semitic languages accidentally bring it closer to other Semitic languages, Hebrew in particular. And that's it. As I said at the outset, this was not intended as a serious video making a serious point, but I still hope others found this interesting. You know, I especially hope that those named Morteza, or those who are interested in the name Mortaza, you know, for example, when they use it as an epithet, as a title for Ali, find it interesting how the name relates to the closest related Hebrew term. And on that note, I'll close here. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.